Maggie, how did you become involved with the Adams papers in the first place?
Well, I was hired by them to be an editor. I had a background in history and in book publishing, and they were looking for a new editor. And really, before I came to them, I did not know much at all about the Adamses or the Adams family. I had just learned the kind of basic things in school, but
What was your schooling in?
my schooling was in history, in American history, and actually I'm a specialist in religious history and women's history. So this was a little bit of a jump in a different direction. But I was originally hired to work on what's called the public papers of John Adams, which are his diplomatic writings, his legislative papers, those kinds of things. But due to some changes in the office, I ended up being responsible for the family papers, which is the correspondence among the different family members, and particularly John and Abigail's correspondence to one another. That's really the heart of what we call the Adams Family Correspondence series. And that's really where I got to sort of start digging into not just the whole Adams family, but particularly the relationship between John and Abigail.
Very exciting. How did you go through the actual process of transcribing the letters? If looking at them, they're very hard to read.
They are, and it takes some practice to learn how to read their handwriting. But I think it's like anybody else's handwriting. If you read a lot of it, you get used to it. It's the same way that you know your spouse's handwriting, and probably somebody else can't read that handwriting, but you can. And it's the same sort of thing. You start out and you really struggle, and it's very slow and pondersome. And then little by little, you just become familiar with it to the point where you can look at it and go, oh yeah, that's what she's saying. The project, the Adams Papers project, has existed for 60 years now, and they have been slowly transcribing all of this material over the years. So when I started with the project about 10 years ago, there was already a huge mass of material that had been transcribed and been published. And in fact, really, the organization and the preservation of the papers, they date back to John Adams himself. He was the first one to say, we need to preserve these papers. In fact, he wrote to his grandchildren, whatever you write, preserve. And that was really kind of a family motto almost. So down the generations, each family would collect the papers, would organize them, and little by little they were brought together into this massive collection. And then in the 1950s, when they were open to the public at the Massachusetts Historical Society, which is the institution that owns them and sponsors the Adams Papers, that's when the real transcription of all of them began, and it's an ongoing process.
That's rather amazing that he had that foresight, but I guess he realized he was a pretty important person back then.
He did, but I think it was pretty extraordinary foresight, because I think he recognized much more quickly or much more deeply than many of the other founders of the United States that these papers and his correspondence and Abigail's letters back to him were really the first draft of history, and that this was going to be the first telling of the American Revolution. And so he was conscious very early on that these were things that were worth keeping.
Did he also keep personal diaries and journals that you have access to?
He did. John kept a diary up until the 1780s, and then he really stopped keeping a regular diary. He did try and write an autobiography in the early 19th century, but he only got a little ways into it and kind of ran out of steam. He was always writing, though. So he wrote to family, he wrote to friends, he wrote to colleagues. So it's partially diary, but a lot more of what we know about him comes through his letters, as opposed to the things he just wrote for himself.
Did he write more about the daily activities of the Continental Congress to Abigail than the letters seem to be just very, very general about what was going on?
He wrote less of that to Abigail. He wrote more of those kinds of things to colleagues and friends. So other members of the Congress, law students of his, people he had served with in Boston politics. His letters to Abigail tended to be political in the sense that they talked about the big pictures of what was being discussed, but the nitty-gritty of what was going on in Congress he tended to save for what we call his public correspondence.
Mm-hmm. In one of his letters, it was dated December 18th, 1778, he actually he yells at Abigail for complaining about things.
Yes.
What was she complaining about that got him so upset?
Well, I can actually read you the paragraph that he's responding to, but this was part of a series of letters from when John is first in Europe. And this is a really difficult time for John and Abigail, because while getting letters between Philadelphia and Quincy was difficult, it was not impossible during the Revolution. And you were talking about it taking 2 weeks to a month. Whereas when you're talking about Europe, and particularly in the middle of the Revolution, when the British Navy are attacking American ships, and just the rigors of ship travel, period, it could easily be months. And what was happening was it was taking 4, 5, 6 months before Abigail was getting any kind of response. And then on top of that, John had become very cautious about what he wrote in his private letters. He had an incident in 1775 when some of his letters were captured by the British. And this was en route from Philadelphia. They were captured, and they were published in New York newspapers. New York at that time was controlled by the British.
Was that a common event?
It did happen from time to time, and the British were definitely on the lookout for any kind of letters going from, particularly from congressmen, because they were hoping to find secret information, essentially what was going on, what the debates were. And this actually goes back to your earlier question about why he wasn't always revealing everything in his letters to Abigail. Some of it was confidential, and he wanted to make sure it wasn't caught by the British. But some of his letters were captured, they were published, and they were very embarrassing. He was found, the really embarrassing parts were the ones where he described some of his fellow congressmen, and they were not flattering comments about them. He referred to John Dickinson, who was a Pennsylvania member of the Continental Congress, as a, quote, piddling genius, unquote. And this upset his colleagues, not surprisingly, and so he was sort of humiliated by this. And after that, he got much more careful about what he said in his letters. And while he is more or less emotional in different letters, he overall tended to be much more cautious and much less direct about things than Abigail was. So when he's writing from France, she hasn't seen him in many, many months. He's writing these very kind of almost cold letters. And that's what Abigail accuses him of. And she says, have you exchanged blood with a Laplander? Meaning, has your blood frozen? Do you no longer care? Do you no longer love me? And that's where he gets very upset, because he feels she's unfairly accusing him of not appreciating her enough, and that he's in this very difficult position where he has to be very careful about his correspondence. He's also enormously busy. And, it's not his fault that the letters are taking 6 months to get to Abigail. At the same time, Abigail just wants him to say, I love you, I miss you, I wish you were here, kind of thing. And John is unwilling to do that. And there's several letters back and forth during that time period. My favorite is actually one where the first letter Abigail receives after months and months and months of silence is this very sort of short, pithy note from John that basically spends most of it describing how wonderful and brilliant the French ladies are, and how Benjamin Franklin is enjoying himself very much with the French ladies, and how John wishes that American women had the same education as the French ladies, on and on and on. Well, Abigail is not best pleased by this. She doesn't want to hear about the French ladies and how lovely they are. And so she writes back quite a lengthy diatribe about how American women ought to have access to education, and humph. And that was it. And that's really, you see that in some of those letters where it's really hard if you're only communicating once every couple of months or once every 6 or 9 months to try and keep that relationship alive. And I think you see some of the cracks there in some of those letters.